Okay, so welcome Rick Straggenborg, and to myself, welcome Jake Counts. And what we're going to do is a series of videos basically discussing topics that are going around in society. And what Rick and I are going to try to do is show you guys constructive ways to have conversations to actually get somewhere rather than beating each other over an ideological, beating each other with the ideological broom. So Rick, what topic would you like to cover this evening?
Well, central to what you just talked about, I think, is the whole idea of learning not to label ourselves. If we're going to have a real productive conversation, we need to learn to look at the issues themselves rather than automatically try to place any idea in a box and then figure out whether we're for or against it before we have a conversation about it. We need to try to avoid buzzwords like liberal and conservative, which people are going to interpret whatever way they want to, whether they like the term or consider it an insult. So it's especially bad when we label ourselves. So I really want to encourage people to not do that.
No, I would agree, and this is something you and I talk about a lot, even though we both come from different philosophical, ideas of what we would like to see in society, or, we do have a couple of, differences of how we would like to get there, I guess. But at the end of the day, you and I both agree that the corruption is a main issue, and so we can utilize the tools that are out there for us, like the internet and conversations among each other, to kind of get everybody on the same page. And like you said, if we can avoid the buzzwords, then we can really start making some traction on what's really going to bring society down. And you can look at it from a whole bunch of different angles, but I think a lot of it has to do with what you were talking about. It's the grammar that we're using in society on a day-to-day basis. Whether we're going after terms that are buzzword terms like liberal, conservative, Republican, Democrat, those are all labels in order for somebody to go ahead and prejudge the individual that's in front of them. And what we're trying to do here is get past the idea that a label either shields you or a label puts you in a group that is not the best light as opposed to the person you're talking with. So if you're a Republican and somebody labels themselves as a Democrat, then you automatically have this unspoken standoff between one another. And if you really get down to brass tacks, wouldn't you agree that most people want the same thing at the end of the day, and they just have different ways to go about it?
Well, that is my point, and I'd put it very similar to the way you did, but maybe slightly different. We all share common values, and one of the assumptions that people have about liberals, if they're not liberals, or conservatives, if they don't consider themselves conservatives, is that the other side's values are all whacked out. But the truth is, when you get to the core values, we all have very similar values. Family values. How in the world is that liberal or conservative? That's nuts. Obviously, everybody loves their family. Some people don't love anybody else. Maybe you don't get along with them, but even then, most people would say, well, I still got to love them. It's my mom, it's my dad, it's my brother, sister. The decisions that we're talking about that we need to make as a nation, if we're ever going to be free, will involve us having to consider the interests of everybody. So if we consider half of the population to be the other, and not one of us, how are we ever going to have that dialogue? How are we ever going to get such a majority of Americans on the same page on anything that we can tell Congress and the president, this is the will of the American people, and you have to follow it because we're supposed to be a democracy? Ain't going to happen as long as we're fighting each other. We need to identify who the real enemy is and unite to fight that enemy. And I submit that ultimately it's the bankers, the people on Wall Street, that are the real manipulators of power and the manipulators of government. And the whole idea that Democrats or Republicans are responsible is ridiculous. I mean, we can argue about which is worse, but the truth is that because of our system of privately financed elections, obviously that's going to lead to the people with the most money having the most influence. And if you look at who that is, it's the banksters.
No, and I would agree wholeheartedly with you. And to take it a step further, typically they fund both sides, so it doesn't really matter who wins. Obviously they have a favorite that they play, but look at Barack Obama and Mitt Romney. They both shared a lot of the same donors. So when we talk about this kleptocracy or this oligarchy that basically that the United States has created now, with a small group really pulling the strings behind the scenes, and the politicians that are in front of us telling us one thing and doing something else, that's not an Americana value, and that's once again back to an idea of corruption. And if we can all kind of understand that putting our petty differences aside and understand that putting our labels aside and having a conversation with the person in front of you, and don't defend the status quo. Challenge yourself to understand, why do I think this way? Why do I consider myself a conservative? And I find it very beneficial, Rick, and I'm sure that you do as well. And you've been in multiple conversations with me before. I like to ask a lot of questions and let the other person talk, because the person that's typically doing the talking is not the one listening, and you gain much more from listening than you do from just shooting your mouth
Absolutely.
off,
And you
so
know
to speak. So
something?
that's my two
Every
cents for
time I
that.
talk to a thoughtful conservative, I learn something new. And I don't say that because I consider myself a liberal, but I am. Most of the people I associate with do consider themselves liberals, and I do hear an echo chamber effect from people who still buy into this duopoly, or this idea that there's two parties and one represents us and the other doesn't. It's ridiculous. I can't listen to it anymore. I need fresh ideas,
Hmm.
because again, I don't consider myself a liberal or a conservative. When I was growing up here in Oregon, there wasn't that much difference. And in fact, we didn't use those terms. We used the terms
Hmm.
Democrat and Republican. And back then, I was as likely to vote for a Republican as a
Sure.
Democrat, and so were people throughout Oregon. You look at our record, our governors were about half Democrats and half Republicans, our senators and representatives also. Because back then, our politicians argued the issues, and people argued the
Hmm.
issues. They didn't, I put themselves in these little boxes and pick a side and treat politics like a football game. It isn't. It's way more important, and it actually has real world effects on all of us. So we need to talk to each other about what we want. And you said it, it's about corruption. In fact, that's how I want to finish up my comments, is just if we can agree on that, we can disagree on almost everything else. But let's talk about how we end the corruption, the corrupting influence of special interest money in politics. There's ways we can do it. My favorite thing that I'm working on is a
Hmm.
constitutional amendment that would reform campaign finance and abolish corporate personhood. Well, it's going to take an overwhelming majority of Americans to support that in order to pass it. I think we can do it, but it all starts when we learn to talk to each other and just take off the ideological blinders, quit labeling ourselves, and remember that we're all Americans. And if we're going to ever be a democratic republic, then we need to learn to listen to each other and make group decisions in the interest of everybody.
No, I would definitely echo your sentiments there. And I guess my closing point would be exactly what you talked about. This is not a football game, and life makes it very easy for us to choose sides. It's black or white. We're always told that when we're growing up. But unfortunately, you've been on this planet just as long as I have, if not a little bit longer, and you understand the facts that the more that you learn, the less you realize that you know, and the more that you want to learn. So we need to get to a point of understanding that we don't really know everything, and at the end of the day, the person next to you that you label a conservative or a liberal is just a person. I mean, we can talk to each other, and like you said, you might learn something from asking somebody where they developed their, political ideas from. Maybe they had an experience that you've never had before, and it might be something worth, putting into your database and saying, well, I've never thought of it that way. So, at the end of the day, like you said, it's much more important than just the political ideological football. that's used as manipulation in order to get us to infight with one another. So there really isn't a discussion over things that are real issues. But I think that the American people are starting to make strides in having those conversations. Putting our adult pants on and saying, okay. I know that you and I don't agree on everything, but let's talk. What can we agree on? And I think that, like you said, at the end of the day, we can all agree that corruption is what's going to drive a nation. It's what drives every nation and every empire into the ground, is rampant corruption and an overzealous and a completely overswollen bureaucratic class, and that's where we're getting here in the United States. So for Rick, why don't you tell people where they can find your work and what you're working on, and I'll tell them where they can find my stuff, and tune in, in a week or so, and we're going to post these videos rather frequently, just because these are conversations that we think are important. And if you think that they're important, then comment in the comment section, and give us some ideas of new topics that you'd like to hear us talk about, and share this with people that you believe would benefit from the conversations that we're having here today.
I do every week. I actually record episodes more often than that a lot of the time. People can go to Soldiers for Peace International, my website, and get to all the podcasts from there. They can get to the Facebook page of Soldiers for Peace International. And basically, Soldiers for Peace International, the whole idea is to wake people up to the fact that war is not inevitable, and when enough people reject the self-fulfilling prophecy that it is, we can end it. But we can only do that together, and that's why I wanted to do this series.
Well, that's great. And you guys can find my work at We Are Not Cattle. Very similar sentiment. Once we have awakened to the paradigm and to the idea that force and coercion are not always needed, and they are obviously the antithesis of what being a human being is about. We're here to love each other and nurture each other and to share with each other. We're not here to steal, rob, and destroy from each other. So that's what we're about. And tune in very soon for another episode.